Good morning, Excellencies, colleagues, dear friends. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the virtual discussion presented jointly by the Permanent Mission of Armenia to the United Nations and the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect on the occasion of International Day of Commemoration and Dignity of the Victims of the Crime of Genocide established with the General Assembly Resolution 69-323 in 2015. As the main sponsor of the resolution, Armenia is fully committed to further advancing this important platform through organization of thematic events. The purpose of today's conversation is to discuss the role of education in confronting genocide denial and in the prevention of atrocity crimes. It has been said many times before that impunity leads to recurrence, and that denial, justification, and glorification of past atrocities create most fertile ground for future crimes. The Armenian people indeed have firsthand experience in confronting systematic campaigns of denying historical facts and preventing them from being taught in schools, portrayed in movies, or included in museum exhibits in order to abstract in every way possible general acknowledgement of the truth. The deliberate state-sponsored efforts to deny the historical reality of the Armenian genocide have been employing various narratives, including those based on attempts to reinterpret international law to claim that the killings do not fit the definition of genocide because the events predate their legal concept, failing to account for the well-documented historical fact that it was precisely with reference to the systematic extermination of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire that Raphael Lemkin originally coined the term genocide. Often, denialists seek to challenge and mischaracterize the existing scholarly consensus as a subject of legitimate debate protected under the freedom of expression, while criminalizing at the national level any public acknowledgement of the Armenian genocide, or to involve false and morally unsustainable allegations claiming that, quote, Armenia's archives are inaccessible for research, fabrications which we have seen long dismissed by reputable international scholarship and which must be acknowledged for what they are: bad faith arguments for self-justification. Whatever methods the efforts to deny the Armenian genocide seek to involve, all of them invariably run contrary not only to the vast body of existing historical evidence, but also to the findings of the reports mandated by the United Nations, including the report of the United Nations War Crime Commission of 1948 and the report adopted by the Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights in 1985, prepared by Benjamin Whitaker, confirming that the systematic Ottoman massacres of Armenians in 1915, without any question, meet the criteria for the United Nations definition of genocide. Despite continuous efforts of the international community in support of the genocide prevention agenda, mass atrocities continue to persist, often to the lack of acknowledgement and condemnation of the past crimes. In this regard, education, in particular human rights education and genocide education, can play an important role in promoting remembrance and awareness, to preserve historical memory and promote truth, justice, and reconciliation. Fostering effective international cooperation will be crucial to this end, and Armenia is fully committed to that. We also support the work of the United Nations Office of Genocide Prevention and the responsibility to protect in promoting national and international efforts to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, and encourage further development of national and international early warning mechanisms and strengthening of the prevention capacities of the United Nations. Dear friends, I have now the honor to introduce the video message of His Excellency Mr. Vahe Gevorkyan, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Armenia on the occasion of observance of the International Day of 9 December. Please play the video.
Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you at the virtual discussion organized by the Permanent Mission of Armenia to the United Nations and the Global Center for Responsibility to Protect in observance of the International Day of Commemoration and Dignity of the Victims of the Crime of Genocide and of the Prevention of this crime. Established upon Armenia's initiative in 2015, the International Day of 9 December has since served as an inclusive platform that brings together governments, international organizations, academic community, and civil society to deliberate methods of delivering on the pledge, never again. Armenia, as a nation which has survived the genocide, has been an advocate for the fight against to detect and act on the warning signs which may lead to massive crimes. Ladies and gentlemen, among the tools for genocide prevention, education is the single most powerful instrument, relevant as ever, in particular against the backdrop of a disturbing surge in tendencies of disinformation, incendiary rhetoric, and hate speech. On December 9 to 11, 2018, Armenia hosted the third Global Forum against the crime of genocide, dedicated to prevention of genocide through education, culture, and museums. One of the most important goals of this forum were to study the issues of genocide prevention through education and science, to raise awareness on the challenges of genocide education, and to discuss steps to be undertaken and effective methods to address those challenges. The importance of teaching out past genocides was also underlined in the resolution of the prevention of genocide presented by Armenia and unanimously adopted by the Human Rights Council in June 2020. The resolution emphasizes the necessity to preserve evidence and archival material related to past genocides, reflects the developments related to this issue in the modern world, and is in line with the priorities set by United Nations. Thus, referring to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the document emphasizes that its fourth goal should be achieved through teaching about the genocides committed in the past. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the main reasons that leads to genocide, as well as other crimes against humanity, is impunity. Inappropriate condemnation of past crimes and avoiding of punishment create fertile ground for denial and justification of genocide and eventually recurrences of mass atrocities. Armenian people has a long-standing record of confronting what represents the final stage of a genocide process, denial of genocide, manifesting itself in many ways, primarily through narratives that conceal historic evidence and the scale of genocidal effort, embark on legalistic manipulations, blame the victims, trivialize their suffering, defend and even glorify the perpetrators, and in doing so, strive to create a space which will intimidate and silence the survivors across generations. The denialists stop at nothing, robbing the victims of their dignity and truth, indeed, represents the ultimate manifestation of genocide, a double killing. As Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel explained, because if victims of genocide are allowed to be forgotten, the dead will be killed a second time. Undoubtedly, supporters of genocide prevention agenda should heed the lessons of the Armenian case to fight impunity and counter denial. For over a century, it has fallen to the survivors of the Armenian genocide, their descendants, and the international community of human rights advocates to keep the memory of the genocide alive by pursuing the recognition of the truth and its proper representation in the educational and cultural fields. History And current practices show that countries that have brought the policy of denial to the level of state ideology will never be able to build a genuine democracy, because they will not be able to ensure freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, protection of minorities, and other fundamental rights. Thus, the recognition of a genocide crime is indeed, by these countries themselves, is a basis for the further development of democracy and the promotion and strengthening of human rights. Distinguished colleagues, genocide and other mass atrocities are usually pre-planned and are carried out by targeting the civilian population, destroying cultural and religious heritage, and spreading extreme hatred. All these actions were carried out against the people of Nagorno-Karabakh during the military aggression unleashed on September 27, 2020, which was planned and implemented by Azerbaijan with the full political and military support of Turkey, and the involvement of foreign mercenaries and terrorist fighters. Thus, with new victims of mass atrocities, the Armenian people were once again exposed to existential threat. Yet, as their ancestors, they are destined to counter and overcome this threat with a stronger determination to safeguard their identity and serve humanity for the betterment of mankind. Ladies and gentlemen, as a member of the international community, Armenia is strongly committed to global efforts to prevent genocide. Collective efforts for effective learning and education on genocide and mass atrocities could be a key component to the prevention of such acts. I thank you.
I thank the Deputy Minister Gevorkyan for his remarks. Now I'm pleased to introduce the video addressed by Ms. Alice Vairimu Naderitu, the Special Advisor of the Secretary General on the Prevention of Genocide.
Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen,
Distinguished guests, it is my pleasure to be with you today at this event on the role of education in combating genocide denial. At the outset, let me extend my gratitude to the Permanent Mission of Armenia and the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect for convening this meeting. Today marks the International Day to commemorate the dignity of the victims of the crime of genocide. And to celebrate it, my office is organizing an event at 11 a.m. today with a focus on the topic of youth and their role in atrocity prevention and peace building. Today is also the 73rd anniversary of the adoption of the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The relevance of this international legal instrument is as strong today as it was when it was adopted. More than 75 years after the Holocaust and more than 25 years after the genocides in Rwanda and Bosnia-Herzegovina, we remain very concerned about the persistent incidents of speech denying or distorting the historical reality of these genocides or glorifying their perpetrators. As highlighted in the framework of analysis for atrocity crimes developed by my office, genocide denial constitutes a warning sign of societal fragility and of the enduring presence of the conditions that allowed large-scale hatred and violence to erupt in the past. It can also create a sense of fear among victims of past genocides and can give rise to immediate danger. In the same vein, glorification of perpetrators of genocide and atrocity crimes impedes accountability and can enhance their ability to fuel further hatred and violence. In my capacity as Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, I've been particularly outspoken in expressing alarm about the harmful potential of genocide denial. In a July 2021 statement reflecting on recent developments in Bosnia and Herzegovina, following my visit to this country, I stressed that the denial of genocide and the glorification of perpetrators simultaneously feeds on and strengthens contested narratives about the past, the present, and the future. It turns perpetrators and war criminals into heroes. It sows fear, mistrust, and hate. It divides people, communities, and states. It does not allow for healing and empathy. It also undermines the judicial decisions that have is to the contrary of what societies which have experienced conflict and have a legacy of atrocity crimes require. It is unacceptable and must be condemned. In August 2021, I also visited Rwanda and was alarmed by the extent of denial of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, which exists within the country and abroad. Growing trends of genocide denial in this country are not only equalizing criminals and victims of the genocide, but also raise the risk of potential commission of such crimes in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, many countries around the world have enforced laws generally prohibiting advocacy of racial, religious, or national hatred that constitutes incitement to hostility, discrimination, or violence, and have applied this to particularly egregious cases of expression denying the Holocaust or other genocides. However, legislation should only be used for the most serious instances where Holocaust and genocide denial reaches a threshold of incitement to hate speech, in line with the Rabat Plan of Action. To fully address this phenomenon, we need therefore to look at comprehensive policy measures, including awareness raising and education. Education plays a fundamental role to address this phenomenon and mitigate its harmful impacts. Education has the power to transform lives and help people be more responsible in all spheres of life. Education shows us the importance of hard work and at the same time helps us grow and develop. When we are educated, we can shape a better society to live in by knowing and respecting rights, laws, and regulations. But most importantly, education shows the difference between good and bad, true and false, right and wrong. It can also help us to learn values of respect, non-discrimination, and inclusion, as well as provide us with critical thinking skills. In his 2019 report to the Human Rights Council on the Prevention of Genocide, the Secretary General noted the importance of education about the past as a key part of preventing atrocity crimes. Indeed, teaching about a recent past of atrocity crimes is important to ensure that the crimes and their consequences are not forgotten. It is also important because lessons can be learned from the long-term root causes or short-term drivers leading to the commission of such crimes. By understanding these processes and by being able to identify early warning signs, new generations will be able to prevent recurrence of similar violent events. In this way, education strengthens society's resilience to atrocity crimes, and my office is prioritizing education as a key tool to prevent atrocity crimes. We are currently implementing education projects in Asia and Africa with a focus on genocide prevention, which could serve as models for other regions to consider as well. In Asia, we are partnering with civil society organizations to incorporate atrocity prevention into education system through capacity building activities that have already been initiated. In Africa, we are organizing the first ever African Genocide Scholar Studies Forum in Dakar in just a few days. The forum will bring together scholars from across the continent to discuss and develop academic knowledge and expertise on mainstreaming genocide and other atrocity crime studies in Africa. My office is also planning to develop a plan of action for school teachers and educators that will also include recommendations on tackling Holocaust and genocide denial in school settings. In addition, tomorrow, as part of my office's engagements during the International Day of Commemoration and Dignity of the Victims of the Crime of Genocide and of the Prevention of this crime, we are organizing an expert webinar with a focus on genocide denial legislation and the need to preserve freedom of opinion and expression. This expert webinar will inform the work of my office and other United Nations entities involved in providing support to various stakeholders in addressing this key issue. I look forward to today's discussion and to taking this work forward as part of our ultimate objective to protect human dignity and save human lives. Thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Special Advisor Naderita for her message and for her important contribution in advancing the prevention agenda globally. Now I'd like to warmly welcome the co-host of our today's event, Ms. Sabita Pandey, Executive Director of Global Center for Responsibility to Protect, also kindly agreed to moderate our discussion. I also welcome our very special and distinguished panelists, Dr. Khachik Muradian from Columbia University, Dr. Taner Akçam from Clark University, Ms. Tali Nates, the Executive Director of Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, joins us from South Africa, Ms. Andrea Gittelman, Program Manager at the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and Mr. Jack Meyerhofer, the Deputy Executive Director of Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. I now pass the floor to the moderator of today's event and look forward to the interesting discussion. Sabita, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Good morning to all of you and welcome to this very important discussion today. I would like to begin by thanking the Permanent Mission of Armenia to the United Nations for co-hosting this event with us. And I would also like to thank His Excellency Mr. Vahe Gevorgyan, Deputy Foreign Minister of Armenia, and also Ambassador Margaryan, Permanent Representative of Armenia to the United Nations, and Ms. Alice Ndurtu for her very, very thoughtful remarks. Before we begin, I just wanted to note that this event is, you can watch it through Zoom, but it's also being live telecasted through UN Web TV. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to put them on chat and we will address them after the panelists have made their presentations. You can also interact us with on Twitter by tagging us at GCR2P and by tagging the Armenian Mission to the United Nations on Twitter. So by systematically negating the facts of history, genocide deniers manufacture doubt, seed discord and mistrust, strengthen contested narratives about the past, present, and future, and create conditions that may lead to recurrence of atrocity crimes. Education can play an important role in preventing genocide denial by providing a forum to recognize and address past atrocities while promoting the knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes that can help prevent future identity-based violence. It is my honor again to introduce these very, very distinguished panelists who will draw upon their unique experience and share their thoughts on the role of education in combating genocide denial, including through the work of museums, including through education in schools, and by also educating and influencing policymakers and decision makers. So again, to just introduce very briefly our very distinguished panel, we have Dr. Taner Akçam, who is a historian and sociologist and professor of history at Clark University. Ms. Tali Nates, Executive Director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center in South Africa. Dr. Khachik Muradian, lecturer in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University. Ms. Andrea Gittelman, Program Manager at the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And Mr. Jack Meyerhofer, Deputy Executive Director of the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. So I would like to begin this panel by giving the floor to Dr. Taner Akçam. Sir, the floor is yours. I'm sorry, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Thank you so much for the introduction. And Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for inviting me to this very meaningful panel. I have been asked to speak on the importance of education in the struggle against genocide denialism. Before going any further, I should state that while I have spent my entire life as an educator, I'm not an expert on the role of education in shaping human life and behavior. What I do know is that the debate over its role is a part of a broader question that is as old as human history, namely, how do we turn people away from behavior that is considered to be morally wrong and direct them towards the good? Since ancient times, societies have developed two main approaches. One is the path of educating people towards the good, and the other, the imposition of deterrence, punishment, away from the bad. These two methods eventually coalesced into two major schools of thought, and whenever a society faces a new type of misbehavior, the proponent of both schools tend to weigh in predictable fashion on the more effective way to counter it. This is not to claim that the schools are mutually exclusive in their approaches, or that one of the two is wholly right and the other wholly wrong. A sound approach to the problem would seem to lie somewhere in between. Since its appearance, organized religion, that great socializing and moralizing institution, has used both persuasion and punishment to produce the desired moral behavior among the adherents. Within such a framework, I'm willing to acknowledge a role for education in the struggle against genocide denialism. But by education, I mean something far broader than what we are taught in schools. Education here is not limited to the topics taught to the students, but to that which I also involves the public sphere, the educating of masses in a struggle for truth. When I think of education's role in combating denialism, I envision our task as a broader engagement with civil society, where we must engage the attention of the general public. As for the role of traditional classroom education in fight against denialism, I have to admit to a marked tendency towards pessimism. I do not wish to brush off the role of school education entirely, however. I still hold the value and importance of education in general. Regardless its ultimate effect, it is still one of the few options we have, and we should thus employ it to the greatest extent possible. So why the pessimism? It derives from the fear that by focusing too large an importance on the role of school education, we are liable to overlook and even conceal a number of other more important factors. The most important of these is the fact that in its essence, denialism not in itself a question of proper or faulty pedagogy, but it is a part of a struggle for power in the public sphere. One of the challenges in combating denialism, I believe, is that it does not appear to be a component of a political struggle, and thus it tends not to be engaged at the level, but in one of the field of ideas and understanding. Simply educating students with the right ideas or proper behavior will not and cannot produce the desired changes. The attempt to separate the educational struggle against denialism from the political one is like embracing the Pope's Sunday sermons as the principal method for fighting crimes. But my pessimism doesn't end there. I'm sorry to say. Even were to broaden our horizon beyond the school walls and embark on an extensive campaign to inform and educate the general public on denialism, I would still feel little cause for hope, I'm afraid, and I will explain myself more fully. First, we must ask, why must we bestow such importance on the subject of denialism by discussing and debating it at such length? The principal reason, as we know, I believe, is to help prevent future atrocities such as genocide. An indispensable part of future genocide prevention is the struggle to make past atrocities both known and acknowledged. Recognition and prevention are inextricably linked, and the fight against denialism must become a more significant part of our efforts to address genocide. Unfortunately, that has yet to happen. I see no such connection strongly, or the notion of causality in the existing literature. This, I would suggest, is the result of a mindset, a logic that I call temporal compartmentalization, namely the tendency to place the past and present in different boxes and to deny or ignore the interconnectedness. To the best of my understanding, there are two mutually supporting arguments that dominate the discussion of denialism. First is the fact that denial is often seen as accepted as a mistaken, but nevertheless an ideological, maybe tolerable approach towards mass atrocities. The second argument relates to the first and assumes that the act of confronting denial is establishing a moral attitude towards a single crime or series of crimes long forgotten in the past of history. Any connection with the present is effectively walled off. These misperceptions are a logical consequence of temporal compartmentalizations. According to this logic, you hear that in the politique almost every day, if we understand denialism only as an opinion or evaluation of the past historical events, albeit a wrong one, and therefore potentially amenable to change in the face of new or different evidence, this is the following argument that we frequently hear from the politicians. Rejecting denialism and demanding the recognition of historic crime may well be a meaningful and amenable moral attitude. However, what is more important and more realistic is to prioritize the compelling security and national interest of contemporary states. Accordingly, in situations where the recognition of an historic crime is in conflict with the national interest and security of the nation states today, it is meaningless at best, counterproductive at worst, to demand recognition because the event in question has long passed. Real-world demands do not allow us to indulge in such moralism. This is, fundamental moralist attitude we were mostly criticized and condemned. This is a mindset sorely in need of amending. Denialism is not simply an opinion about past historical events that is open to persuasion or reason, nor it is approach or effects limited to those past events. Rather, denialism is a structure that has produced and continues to produce and promote certain social and political policies in the present day. In the case of Turkey, the example of which I'm most familiar, I would argue that there is an undeniable interconnectedness between Armenian genocide denial and Turkish government's current policies in the Middle East. The so-called Armenian question, which occupied the attention and energies of both the Ottoman Empire and European powers for the past 4 decades of the former existence, originated in Armenian request for equality and social reforms, a call which arguably could have led a stronger and more modernized Ottoman society. A similar situation exists with Turkey's Kurdish population today. Like the Armenians of the late Ottoman period, the Kurds are demanding social and political reforms. Granting these basic rights could be the foundation for a more inclusive and democratic Turkey. In the past, not only the Armenian demands, but the Armenians themselves were considered security threats, something which caused them to become targets for massacres and genocide. Today, the Kurds face a similar fate. Denying the truth about the Armenian genocide and suppressing basic democratic rights of Kurds and other ethnic religious minorities constitute the foundation of the Turkish concept of security today. Once again, demand for truth and justice from the state and request for basic democratic rights, such as equality under the law, social reform, and freedom of speech, are deemed threat to national security. The picture is very clear. By continuing to deny what happened in 1915, Turkey reproduces the institutions, social relations, and mindsets that created the event of 1915 in the first place. Denialism is not simply a historical defense of an old regime, Ottomans. It also fuels the politic of continuing aggression, both internally against the country's ethnic religious minorities and democratic opposition, and abroad against the country's neighbors. My view of this correlation is simple. As long as Turkey continues to regard the honest accounting with its history and the acknowledgement of the past wrongdoing as potential threats to the national security, security problems will continue to present themselves. So, bottom line, my last sentence, the denial of any genocide is not simply a historical debate, one that be disregarded or sidelined when confronted with more pressing contemporary issues. On the contrary, it is an indispensable component for solving current problems related to democracy and human rights. In concluding, I will leave you with the following suggestion. Before speaking of the importance of education, be it in the classroom or in the public square, we must first decide what it is we will be teaching. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Akçam, for those very thoughtful remarks. I think that we all learned a lot about sort of the different correlations between genocide denial and the present political environment and the present sort of denial of, in many cases, rights or seeing people as equal. Thank you very much for that. And now I would like to give the floor to Tali.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, dear Ambassador, dear Savita. I will share my screen. Coming from South Africa, I would like to join you with some visuals from the country. And let me just do it on full screen. Never again. Empty words used for the first time after the Holocaust are used again and again. Genocides happened before there was a word, before 1939, to the Herero and Nama in today's Namibia, to the Christian Armenians and the Ottoman Empire, and of course, after the Holocaust, from Cambodia to Rwanda, from Srebrenica to Myanmar. The words of Auschwitz survivor and writer Primo Levi that actually welcome anyone that is coming to our center in Johannesburg, the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, says it happened, therefore it can happen again. This is the core of what we have to say. It can happen, and it can happen anyway. These words are critical. We need to reflect on them, and we need to learn from them. However, every genocide in history has its deniers and distorters. The latest August 9 of 2021 survey on trust in museums show that museums are a highly trusted source of information, with history museums at over 78% trust, and that is much higher, more than 20% higher than any news media. In a world where there is an assault on truth, where nationalism, populism are growing, museums and memorials play an important role in remembrance and education, and this needs to be used wisely, cannot be abused. Amongst the many challenges we face is the passing of the survivor generation of many genocides. I would say up to Cambodia of 1975. The witnesses of the atrocities who share their painful memories with the public, with students, and played an active role in the education programs of so many museums are passing on. This pushed museums to develop and use different educational tools, including descendants' testimonies, films, resources, books, and the latest technology. And just for one example, the Dimensions in Testimony exciting project of the USC Shoah Foundation that uses a question-answer way with different survivors of different genocides comes to mind. Our center, the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, published short educational testimonies of Holocaust and Rwandan survivors who settled in South Africa to make that connection to our country. It can be accessed freely through our website and also exist in printed versions. Museums' role is to draw attention and invite active listening to the stories and warnings of the survivors. Nobel Peace Prize winner and Holocaust survivor mentioned before, Elie Wiesel, said, when you listen to a witness, you become a witness. So the witnesses over the years who listens for many years to the survivors are now the witnesses. They are now tasked in sharing the testimonies that they heard. To combat denial, the inclusion of genocide in school curriculums is crucial. In South Africa, in 2007, the subject of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust and connections to other genocides became compulsory to all grade 9 students. And those who choose history for their matriculation exams learn about genocide again and about the Holocaust again in grade 11. Including genocide and the Holocaust in a national curriculum, training teachers in teaching about this subject, creating reliable resources to support this teaching, and making sure there are departments at a university level that also teach and research about this is crucial to make sure denial and distortion cannot win. Development of museums and memorials like the ones I'm representing, and the museums in South Africa, in Cape Town, in Durban, and in Johannesburg, and I'm very proud and honored to be the chair of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation, the association of the 3 centers, is an important source for education and memory in our country. The museums support the schools in fulfilling the mandate to teach about genocide, but it goes beyond the schools. It goes to the public, to universities, to the media, to thought leaders, and to politicians. As the founder of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, let me speak briefly about our approach. Our curatorial decision was to tell the history in a multi-directional way, to make connections, to make it relevant to today. We chose to focus on the history of genocides in the 20th century, starting in 1904 with the Herero and Nama genocide, then the Armenian genocide of 1915, the Holocaust, and the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. We also look at development of the word genocide through the history of Raphael Lemkin and the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which of course we mark today the 73rd anniversary of. We also look at the aftermath, what happened after. The exhibition also makes connection to South Africa, to our history of crimes against humanity, to human rights abuses now, to the fragility of democracy now. In 2017, a new youth leadership program was developed by us and Aegis Trust in Rwanda, called the Changemakers Program. And this comes with a traveling exhibition. And I want to speak a little bit, just very briefly, about traveling exhibitions and about educational programs that go beyond our country into the African continent. Traveling exhibition about the Holocaust and genocide is now permanently displayed in Mozambique, Nigeria, the Gambia, Rwanda, and Zambia. This youth leadership program, the Changemakers Program, and a train the trainer, so it goes to youth, to teachers, to facilitators, to leaders, strives to build resilience and resistance to violence. It helps to develop the necessary skills to challenge the ideas of extremism. And it encourages participants to become change makers in their society. The program utilizes history, the history of the Holocaust, the genocide in Rwanda, apartheid in South Africa, and also we develop local case studies in the different African countries where we teach. So far, the program was launched in 13 countries in Africa. We actually just came back from Zambia 2 weeks ago. Traveling exhibitions and impactful education programs are an immensely important tool against denial. Let me end with a personal reflection. I'm a daughter of a Holocaust survivor, Moses Turner, who with his brother, Henrik, my uncle, were rescued by Oskar Schindler. They were part of the now very famous list. The rest of my family, including my grandmother, Eleonora, my aunts, my father's sisters, Hela and Sila, were murdered in the killing center of Belzec in then occupied Poland. In November 2021, just a few weeks ago, the local community where my father came from, in Nowy Targ in southwest Poland, led by Dariusz Popila and his civil society organization, People, Not Numbers, researched and established a memorial in the Jewish cemetery with 2,900 names of all those murdered in the town. The gravestone of my grandfather, Tzvi Turner, who passed away before the war, was retrieved from a farm where it was found, restored, and placed back in the cemetery. This, for me, is an inspiring story of how genocide denial can be combated by the community on the ground. So in the end of our exhibition, we have photos of two survivors, both volunteers at our center, Irene Klaas, survived the Warsaw Ghetto, and Sylvester Sendakieye, who survived a church massacre in Gitarama. They said that the world did not learn, that never again was not their reality. The question is, can it become ours? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tali, for that very inspiring discussion and a very inspiring and thought-provoking comments. Really appreciated the sort of how you connected the past to the present and added and ended it by making it something which is very personal, that actually lives of people, rather than just talking about it in a more sort of academic way. So thank you for that. Now I would like to pass the floor on to Dr. Muradian. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for this opportunity. I would like to thank in particular the Armenian Mission for this event. I will try in the time that I have to underline one aspect of this multifaceted discussion on education and denial. And that will be an attempt to first disentangle teaching about genocide from teaching about denial of genocide. And I feel like this is central for educators as we tackle the challenges facing education and the challenges facing teaching about history in the 21st century. Let me say a little bit more about this. I say it's important to disentangle because oftentimes one of the manifestations of the negative aspects of denial, to add to the list that was referenced by the Deputy Minister, by Ambassador Markarian, Professor Akçam, Tali Nats, and others, is that in many ways, when we are making this, when we're thinking about genocide denial, creates an environment where we oftentimes have to be focusing on combating it and pushing back against the arguments of the denialists, as opposed to engaging in education about the dynamics of genocide, aspects such as the agency of the victims, the voice of the victims, and other important components. So in a way, in the aftermath of the genocide, after the killing is over, and after genocide is now present, oftentimes in the aftermath, in more in structural violence, and manifests itself in a variety of aspects of our lives. It also impacts the very attempt to teach about that, that genocide, and to teach about the way we think about victim groups, victimized groups, and their resilience and resistance. To give a quick example, let me focus on the Armenian case. For the longest time, the scholarship on the Armenian genocide has largely focused on pushing back against denialist arguments put forth by the Turkish state, and the scholars that are essentially presenting that kind of position. My generation, of course, is a little bit of a privileged generation in that sense, because I live in the United States right now in an environment, in an era where the Armenian genocide, the denial of the Armenian genocide, is pushed further to the margin, and this is thanks to scholars such as Professor Taner Akçam and others, as well as tremendous activism and advocacy. So in our case, right, we have this luxury of trying to think about genocide denial and the genocide separately, and the history teaching about genocide separately, and have a similar approach in the classroom. So one of the things that is integral to my work in the classroom, and also when I speak to high school students and in other settings, is to, as I said, disentangle these two. Because when we are operating, teaching about genocide under the shadow of genocide denial, we are giving less significance to important aspects, such as I mentioned earlier, strengthening the voices and the narratives of the victim groups, right? Genocide education and scholarship on genocide for a very long time, in the Armenian case, but this is true in multiple cases, has often focused on the perpetrators, right? Because the intention is to pinpoint the enormity of the crime, the role of the perpetrators, and the horrors that were committed. In this kind of narrative, which is more like taking the perpetrator to court or taking the denialist state to court kind of mindset, what becomes absent are the very voices of the victims who are targeted. And this is critical, because ultimately the intention of the perpetrator in the first place was to silence the victims, right? And then we, in all our good intentions, are engaging in a similar act in our struggle to push back against denial. So this is one important component to be mindful of as we are thinking about education and genocide. Another related component to this is that the moment we accept this reality, right, we can also think about denial in a different form. The two previous speakers emphasized the importance between, not compartmentalizing, right, the past and the present, and the connections between the two. I would like to also emphasize the importance of actually thinking about the present and education in the present through intersectionality. In many ways, when we think about denial, oftentimes it is important for us to try to understand denial in an intersectional manner, to try to look at other dynamics of denial around us, whether it is in the social sciences, in the natural sciences, to think about denial for climate change denial, COVID-related denial and false truths, false beliefs, right? And situating the denial of the Armenian genocide or denial of genocides in general, right, in this kind of context. This helps students to first think about these dynamics and essentially discerning such dynamics when they're confronted by it, right? In an age, in an era where manufacturing doubt, right, as it was mentioned in Savita's comment, is very much alive and around us, right? And the assault on truth is very much part of our reality. Genocide denial, yes, is important in terms of thinking about it in terms of national security, in terms of the crimes that are currently being committed in the context of failing to face the past. But for students, I would emphasize the fact that it's also important for them to see it as this intersectional dynamic that we can discern oftentimes in the statements of politicians, in the statements of governments, etc., and it's an essential tool for us in the 21st century. And for the second and final portion of my remarks, I want to go back to emphasizing the voices of the victims, right? Emphasizing the voices of the targeted groups. And this is one of the aspects that gets lost when we are focusing too much, or we sort of are thinking about genocide denial and genocide at the same time. In the classroom, for me, these are treated as separate subjects. When I talk about the Armenian genocide, I emphasize first the life of Armenian communities in their ancestral homeland, right? The Armenian genocide is not a story that starts with when people start getting killed, right? It starts with a long, and the same is true, of course, with all genocides. It starts with a thriving community and culture that is faced with this attack against its existence. So, and the second important aspect is the aftermath, right? The survival and revival. And the genocide is sort of sandwiched, this horrible crime of annihilating the entire group between these two. In many ways, it is an affirmation of the fact that, again, this is not a story just about that starts with people getting killed and when killing people stops, but this is a broader narrative. And second, I emphasize, sort of almost as a pushback against narratives that focus on the perpetrators, on the voices of the victims, on the agency of the victims and the resistance of the victims. Of course, this is integral part of my dissertation, in fact, supervised by Dr. Akçam, my book and my work in general, but ultimately, I believe that is critical. I emphasize, for example, different forms of resistance, unarmed resistance, because I believe that delving into the analysis of, for example, resistance to genocide, right? Students will cultivate an ability to critically examine power dynamics. Power is a topic that was mentioned earlier as well. Issues of choice and voice in the media and public discourse. And this is relevant today. How do we portray refugees and asylum seekers? How do we speak of the experience of victims of sexual violence? How do we present human rights issues of the day? How about breakthroughs in genetics, neuroscience, technology, and their implications on human agency, right? Ultimately, I believe, focusing on resilience and resistance also is good scholarship and good pedagogy, right? In doing so, students will come to see and appreciate human agency and solidarity, even in the most restrictive and perilous of circumstances. And they will consider, right, the resilience against oppression, hatred, and cataclysm as important and central. In a world beset by human rights crises, population displacement emergencies, and environmental cataclysms, reading about genocide, learning about genocide may depress, while pondering resistance and resilience uplifts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those very, I mean, I'm saying this for everybody because all your remarks are so fantastic, encouraging, like to sort of, focus on resistance and narratives of survivor rather than just thinking in terms of perpetrator and not just thinking of genocide as an event, but to think about it in a broader context. And that is truly educational and leaves us with a good thought in terms of how we talk about genocide. And now I will like to give the floor to Andrea.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you in particular to the Permanent Mission of Armenia and to the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect for organizing this important event. I'm representing the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And of course, we understand the enduring importance of confronting genocide denial, and I'm honored to be a part of today's discussion. So the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum stands as a bulwark against genocide denial in a few ways. First, by serving as a memorial to those who were killed and to those who survived the Holocaust. We also fight genocide denial through education, and we have programs geared towards students, the general public, leaders and decision makers in the United States and internationally. But for my remarks today, I wanted to focus in particular on the need to educate policymakers, specifically government officials who are well placed to use their positions to counter genocide denial, to help establish correct narratives and move forward effective genocide prevention efforts. And I'm speaking as part of the Holocaust Museum Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide. And our center strives to do today for communities at risk of genocide what was not done for the Jews of Europe in the 1930s and 40s. Our center monitors early warning signs and threats of genocide and related crimes against humanity. We raise awareness among policymakers and the public and provide options for response and creative thinking about the roles that individuals can play in prevention. So today I'll speak about two cases where the center has sought to advance protection and effective response while countering pretty strong forces of denial. The first case I'll talk about is Syria. The center has worked to document crimes against humanity in Syria and has focused in particular on atrocities, on crimes against detainees. As you know, as part of its campaign of violence, the Syrian government has detained more than 100,000 of its own citizens, often refusing to release names of people who have been detained, and families of the missing often do not know what has happened to their loved ones. The Holocaust Museum created an exhibition called Syria, Please Don't Forget Us, which tells the story of Mansour Omari, who was a survivor of detention and torture. While in prison, Mansour and his fellow prisoners wrote their names on 5 scraps of fabric in ink. They used their own blood and rust to make the ink. They wrote this on scraps of paper, and then when Mansour was released from detention, he smuggled out these pieces of fabric with the names of detainees so that he could inform his cellmates' families about what had happened to them. In the museum, we displayed these pieces of fabric and gave context to the crimes that have taken place and that continue to take place today in Syria's detention facilities. So this exhibition was a way to educate the general public about what is happening, but we also use it as a platform to specifically reach policy and government audiences. We brought, for example, Security Council ambassadors, members of the US Congress, senior government officials from various countries through the exhibition. And using that kind of artifacts of storytelling helps force a conversation among government officials about the failure to prevent atrocities against civilians. And today, these efforts are all the more important as the world contemplates normalizing relations with a government that has committed such unspeakable atrocities. So educational efforts, specifically in this case, the preserving of testimony of artifacts, can remind the world and government leaders in particular about what has happened and what continues to happen in Syria today. The second case is the case of Myanmar, the genocide of the Rohingya community. So the museum has warned for many years about the risk of genocide and mass atrocities being perpetrated against the Rohingya community in Myanmar. The museum has issued reports detailing these risks and has made a formal determination that genocide had been committed. This was after thousands had been killed and hundreds of thousands forced to flee to Bangladesh, this, of course, perpetrated by the Myanmar military. The museum recently opened a new exhibition called Burma's Path to Genocide, an exhibition available both online and in the physical museum in Washington, D.C. And this explores how the Rohingya, a Muslim minority in the country, went from citizens to outsiders and then became targets of a sustained campaign of genocide. And even though the genocide of the Rohingya is well documented, denial persists in Myanmar today. So what this exhibition tries to do is fight denial by sharing publicly the stories of survivors. It also fights the very intent of genocide, which is to erase a people. We feature front and center the voices, the language, the music of the Rohingya people. And this ties into what the previous panelists had mentioned about centering the voices of victims. These are all things that the Myanmar military, in this case, the perpetrator, is trying to eradicate. So I think it's important when we consider education and the role of museums to share stories of what was lost and what remains, and to educate the public not only about what has happened, but what is being destroyed. So we purposely want museum visitors to hear Rohingya survivors speaking in the Rohingya language, to hear Rohingya music, and not have direct translation or only hear about these things in English, but to really preserve what is attempted to being destroyed. In closing, I'll just mention a few things. Educating the public is just one way to counter denial and prevent future atrocities. I think my fellow panelists have made that clear. Education is not just an end in itself. And thinking about the stories of the Syrian detainees, if those stories are forgotten, if the violence against Rohingya civilians is ignored, it's an insult to the victims and survivors and a dangerous red flag to communities at risk in the future elsewhere. Fighting denial, of course, is connected to atrocity prevention. And I would just stress that education about these situations of mass atrocity needs to specifically reach decision makers and future decision makers so that they're inspired to use their own power to counter denial, to ensure that their constituents can do the same, and ultimately to prevent and respond to atrocities today and in the future. I'll close there and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And those the stories that you've just told us, I mean, again, remind us to center the narratives around people, victims and survivors, and to sort of combat something which is so central to the perpetrators of genocide, erasure. So thank you for that. And last but not the least, Jack Muirhofer. The floor is yours, Jack.
Thank you so much, Savita. And I'd like to begin by thanking the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect and the Permanent Mission of Armenia for the invitation to speak today. I'm in so much agreement with what my fellow panelists have already said. So I hope I can add a little bit to that from our experience at the Auschwitz Institute. I'd like to begin my remarks. I am speaking with you from our office in Manhattan, New York. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the original people of the land where I'm speaking to you from, the Lenape, as well as their deep connection to their Lenape-Hoking homeland. At the Auschwitz Institute, as an organization dedicated to atrocity prevention, we believe in the importance of acknowledging the settler colonial genocide perpetrated against this community, and equally importantly, the resilience of the Lenape, who still today continue to resist that erasure. What I'd like to speak to you about, I'd like to provide today a little bit of an introduction in terms of how we at the Auschwitz Institute see the link between education and the prevention of genocide and combating genocide denial, and then speak a little bit about what this work looks like in practice, providing two examples, one in the case of El Salvador and one in Brazil. At the Auschwitz Institute, we view genocide prevention, like genocide itself, we view the prevention of genocide as a process. And we believe there are a continuum of strategies that we can implement for preventing genocide. And that starts with upstream prevention. This is what we can do before conflict is started. And we believe that education plays a particularly important role in upstream prevention. And I'll speak a bit more in a moment about how that is. There's also midstream prevention, what we can do once conflict is started to bring it to a close. And finally, downstream prevention, what we do after the physical manifestations of violence have ended to prevent them from recurring in the future. And of course, this is not a linear line. We believe that there's a cycle of prevention that we work on. When we're speaking about atrocity prevention, we often talk about engaging with different factors that can put a society at greater risk for experiencing atrocities. And there are a lot of important atrocity risk frameworks that are out there. The special advisor already mentioned the UN's framework of analysis. My colleague at the Auschwitz Institute, Dr. James Waller, has produced his own framework of analyses that talk about risk factors within 4 different large categories, those being governance, economic conditions, conflict history, and social fragmentation. And under each of those categories, there are more specific risk factors that, given the greater prevalence of them, can increase the likelihood that an atrocity will take place. So the question is, how can education in particular become a tool for the prevention of genocide and for combating denial? And we believe at the Auschwitz Institute that is done by mitigating those risk factors and strengthening the resilience of a society for prevention. And so some of the risk factors that we believe can be impacted in particular by education, and in this case, I'm speaking about even education of young people in schools, are particularly history of identity-related tensions, legacy of vengeance or group grievance and genocide denial, identity-based social divisions, gender-based discrimination, and low levels of economic development. We believe these are all risk factors for atrocities that can be impacted by education. And we believe that can happen primarily through influencing social values and norms, that education has a capacity. And again, education, of course, is a tool, and it can go both ways, but we believe that education has the capacity for changing the behaviors, the attitudes, and the perceptions of young people. That education can be used to promote resilience through peace education and human rights education that highlight the value of diversity. And we also believe that it can, of course, promote economic development by contributing to the reduction of poverty, boosting economic growth, and increasing the equality of opportunities within a society, rendering it more resilient to risk factors that could lead to atrocities. With regard to combating genocide denial in particular, we believe that education and the education system can confront people with their own identities as either bystanders, perpetrators, or beneficiaries. It can challenge national identities and big questions like who we are and how we got here. It can confront denial directly by challenging those past narratives. From a more productive standpoint or positive standpoint, education can provide students and learners with the critical skills necessary to counter disinformation, such as genocide denial. And it can remove the silence and fill the space that sometimes allows perpetrators to say that genocide never happened, and therefore that allows for impunity to continue. And so given the really important role that we think education plays in prevention, I should mention that at the Auschwitz Institute, we actually work primarily with policymakers. But given this important role that we see education playing, going back to 2015, we created what's now called our Warren Educational Policies Program. And this is a program named after Holocaust survivor Naomi Kaplan Warren. And this program, it supports states and public institutions to educate younger generations on the importance of combating prejudice, hatred, and discrimination as part of an upstream prevention strategy. As I mentioned earlier in my remarks, the things that we can do before conflict has started to build a society that's more resilient to hate speech and more resilient to mobilization for violence. Our program also seeks to assist, in particular, while a lot of our work at the Auschwitz Institute, we work with ministries of foreign affairs or ministries of interior and justice. This program in particular engages with ministries of education, as well as regional and local school systems to effectively integrate educational policies and programming for young people into a broader government strategy for atrocity prevention. And we pursue this in the Warren Educational Policies Program through a series of measures, including research, teacher training is a very big piece of this, toolkit and module development, as well as projects that engage students directly and give them the opportunity to develop their own projects to speak about how they internalize some of these issues. And so I'd like to speak now a little bit, as I mentioned before, about what this looks like in practice, speaking about two particular examples. And I'll speak here, as I mentioned, about El Salvador and in Brazil, our work in these two countries. So in the case of El Salvador, we have been partnering since 2016 with the National Office of the Ombudsman and the Ministry of Education. And from the beginning of our cooperation, our partners identified as a priority the promotion of citizenship, memory, and peace culture, and seeking to find a way to make schools actually a space for promoting a peace culture with younger generations. And so when working with local experts across 2017 and 2018, we produced an educational toolbox to support teachers and administrators in public schools to develop prevention strategies for students around two key topics: citizenship and peace education, with a focus on historical memory related to El Salvador's past. The toolkit, which is called Citizenship, Memory, and a Culture of Peace in El Salvador, was officially launched in October of 2018 through a meeting with over 100 international and national education stakeholders that discussed the relationship between education, memory, and human rights as part of school curricula. And it's important to note here that for almost 25 years, the Ministry of Education in El Salvador didn't teach or didn't include education on the 12-year Civil War in their official school curricula, but now it's incorporating the toolbox into their regular teaching materials. In terms of what the toolbox actually looks like, it's broken up into 3 different books. Book 1 provides an introduction, speaking about El Salvador today, progress and ongoing challenges, and provides an introduction to teachers about what the toolkit is providing. Book 2 speaks more specifically about memory and citizenship, providing a bit of history from liberal reforms to the peace accords of 1992, understanding the construction of a culture of violence based on inequality, and providing a short history of the internal armed conflict. Whereas book 3, that provides teachers themselves with practical tools that they can implement through their teaching with students around learning about school environment, transforming conflict, promoting participation of students in the process, with the goal of building and maintaining a culture of peace. And while I don't have time here to speak in greater detail about what are in each of the toolkits or the books, if you're interested, this is all available at the Auschwitz Institute's website, and I'd be happy to share the link if anyone's interested. And then finally, to close, I want to speak a little bit about our work with our partners in Brazil as well. So in Brazil, we've been working primarily with the Federal Prosecutor for the Rights of the Citizen and the National Secretariat for Global Protection. And again, through a series of consultation meetings throughout 2016 and 2017 with both educators and students, it was raised that one of the key priorities were that due to the current economic and political crisis, it had given rise to increased social polarization, to radicalization, to hate speech, a number of issues that are particularly concerning from an atrocity prevention perspective. And so what we responded to with our partners in Brazil was to create something called the Citizenship and Democracy in School Project. And so unlike in the case of El Salvador, that was looking, in fact, at dealing with El Salvador's past, the case of Brazil was about dealing with students in the classroom to create spaces for the promotion of pluralistic dialogue based on mutual respect and recognition of the value of diversity within Brazil's public classrooms. And the goal of this project in particular was to provide tools to prevent an increase in prejudice and intolerance, to address some of those concerns, while promoting the participation of youth at the center of constructing a more tolerant and democratic-minded society. The way that this project looks like in practice, working again with educational partners, we developed a pedagogical guide for teachers to implement the project directly in their classroom, and provided alongside that training to teachers on how to implement and how to use the guide. And the project itself is broken up into 2 phases. The first engages students in the classroom in discussions and debates on a range of topics such as identity and diversity, dignity and respect, human rights, democracy and the right to information, and citizenship, cooperation, and solidarity. Phase 2 of the project provides students the opportunity to actually take that learning and develop a research project of their own, giving them an opportunity to see how they've internalized that and expressed that through their own creative work. And so projects took the form of illustrated short stories, photography. Some students composed original songs and other creative projects. And in some cases, the projects were actually open to the larger local community to expand beyond just those in the classroom in terms of sharing that learning and sharing that process. And in some cases, community members could even vote on their favorite projects, and students receive prizes for this. And so I know that I think I'm out of time or running out of time here, but I'll just close in saying that we've been really happy to see that even despite the difficulties of COVID throughout 2021, we had more participation in 2021 than all of the previous years of our project in Brazil combined. And so we're very excited to see how we can expand this work to more state secretaries of education and more teachers and more students going forward. So I'll stop there. Savita, thank you very much for everyone's attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you for making that connection so clear between prevention and education about past atrocities, and also sort of to give us a very sort of detailed understanding of what it actually looks like on the ground. So we have a couple of questions, but I think a lot of those questions have been addressed through your presentations. So what I would like to do now is maybe open the floor for the panelists themselves. Like if you want to respond to each other's presentation. Would you like that? Or just some closing thoughts to take with us, if you would like to sort of jump in and talk about that. But I really found each and every presentation so important in this idea of, when we talk about genocide denial, to put resistance and resilience at the center of the conversation, and to put the stories of the victims and survivors, and to combat erasure in a very particular way. So that was very, very inspiring for me to listen to all of you talk about that. So any thoughts, Meher, do you have any thoughts? Just something closing that we can take with us before we go to Karine for a beautiful recital. No thoughts. I think
Well, Savita,
I only want to say
please.
a couple of sentences. I mean, this is only repeating what everybody already emphasized. I mean, education is the only tool that we have in our hand. I mean, despite all critique we have on the content of it, or on the influence of it, on the scope of it, and so on, what else can we do? I mean, in the civil society level, this is one of the most important device, and it makes us also as human. I mean, otherwise we are like the animals. I mean, this is the reason that despite my negative remarks, I would only emphasize continue to educate public, continue to educate politicians, continue to educate our school children.
Ambassador, do you want to jump in?
Well, I want to thank all the panelists for really very inspiring thoughts that they share with us. It has been very interesting session yet to learn also from their unique practical experiences. And indeed, one cannot overestimate the role of education in fighting and combating the denial of genocides. I also want to thank the special advisory for her very important remarks, and of course we will be we are short of time, but I'll pass over back to you, Savita, to introduce also our distinguished guest, the pianist Karine Bogosyan, who will kindly also play a piece of Armenian composer himself, a genocide survivor, Komitas, who witnessed all the horrors of genocide. But Karine will perform one of his masterpieces. Savita, to you back.
Thank you so much for that. And Tali, the last word goes to you.
I just wanted to say also great gratitude to all my fellow panelists, and I think Kachig, bringing the resistance and bringing the targeted groups in the center of our discussion is so important. So I wanted to comment specifically about your latest research and the importance of finding the resources that were hidden for 100 years, or were not known for such a long time. So I don't know if my question was really to you to say the importance of researchers in bringing out those stories to fight denial. I don't know if we have time, but I would love a word from you, Professor Muradian, about that.
Absolutely, we have. I mean, very quickly, Kachik.
Yeah, thank you for your kind words. I truly appreciate it. I do think that much of this is built, and I mentioned this in my work as well. We as scholars stand on, as genocide scholars and historians, stand on the shoulders of the scholars who paved the way before us. And more importantly, I think we stand on the shoulders of the various survivors and the victims and their stories and narratives. And I do think that we, it is part of our task for all those people who were unable, because of their circumstances, to tell their stories and speak about the extraordinary resilience that was manifested during these crimes. It is part of, I think, the scholar's calling to highlight that and make it central to one's work.
Thank you so much for that. And Karine, the floor is yours. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that beautiful performance. And on that note, I would like to thank our panelists again for participating in this very, very interesting discussion. There are not a lot of webinars where I end up learning a lot, but today was one of those webinars where I actually learned something new and learned how to talk about genocide denial in a very specific way. So thank you, everybody, and have a good day, and happy holidays to everybody, and take care. Thank you so much.